of racial apartheid have held its economy back in comparison to some of its neighbours. And in poor townships like Alexandra, you don't have to look far to find examples of the economic change that are rippling across the region.
On the crowded...
You're watching ABC News 24 and we're breaking into programming there to take you live to Darwin, where the Employment and Workplace Relations Minister Bill Shorten is speaking at a TWU event.
Michael Caine. I'd like to acknowledge Jim McGivern and all of the state leaders of the Transport Workers Union. I wanted to come up to this council today because of a number of reasons. But one of the reasons I wanted to come up is just to acknowledge the work that our transport industry and transport workers do in making Australia one of the best countries, if not the best country in the world. When you think about the hours that your members do, in the hours before dawn, when you carry the necessary logistics across the nation into the suburbs and streets where we live, when you bring the shift workers home to their destinations, or perhaps at night, when your members will take the revellers home, or indeed you make our cities work. Transport workers bring the food and medicine to country towns which allow us to live throughout our nation. I can only imagine life without our transport industry. We would be scrambling and hitchhiking. We'd be lost and late for work. You are indeed what ensures that most parents can be reassured that their families and their children can move around this country safely. The Australian transport worker is the safety catch, is the lifebelt, is the parachute, and is indeed the way home for all of us in Australia. Transport workers are the glue and the fuel and the nourishment of our fair-go society. Without you, this great wide continent which we share and live in and call home, we would indeed have the tyranny of distance. But through our transport workers, we are able to conquer the tyranny of distance in the best country on earth. It is appropriate that transport workers have strong transport unions. It is appropriate that people have the ability to belong to the Transport Workers Union of Australia. Without our transport workers, our nation would not be as smart, would not be as fair, would not be as fair-go all-round a society as we aspire it to be. And transport workers without a Transport Workers Union of Australia would indeed not have the conditions which they currently enjoy. It is important to remember that any trade union at any time is the custodian of the conditions which their predecessors have earned and accumulated on behalf of workers in the transport industry. It's important also, I think, for any trade union, and indeed any of us in our community or any business, to ensure that we hand on better conditions than those which we found. I know this is a task which the Transport Workers Union daily dedicates itself to. That is why I'm pleased to be here. But I'm also pleased to be here to report to you that the economy under Labor is going well, is going strongly. There are patches and spots of disadvantage and hardship, but this is a nation which can afford to hold its head up in 2013. Compare now to what it was before the GFC hit. Unlike most first world nations, the Australian economy has grown during this period of global economic instability, grown 13%. And we are expected to outperform most advanced economies over the next 2 years. Transport workers in Australia may not be aware, but Australia is rated by the 3 major global ratings agencies as a AAA credit rating. We are one of only 8 nations in the world who have the AAA credit rating. Despite the alleged budget emergency which our Conservative confect to scare people, the truth is that our public debt is low by global standards, and it is set to peak at 11.4%. This compares remarkably positively to nearly every other advanced nation in the world. This is not an emergency. If the Australian economy was a household, and if Australian economic output was, to use an analogy, $100,000, the interest payments that are required from the Government of Australia annually on $100,000 of household income is $800, and that's at its peak. Our net debt on an economic activity of $100,000 is $11,000. I suspect there'd be many Transport Workers Union with that debt profile who'd go and raise more debt. So the Australian economy does not have a debt emergency. Furthermore, we need investment in Australia, and it's great to see some of the employer representatives here today demonstrating that collaborative and cooperative relationships in the workplace are indeed a reality. When you look at business investment in Australia, at the moment it's 18.5% of GDP. Or in plain English, if GDP is the measurement, is the cake which is the Australian economy, business investment is 18.5% slice of that economic activity. In the Howard years, it was 10%. So something good is happening with business investment in this country, just as it is with our debt position, just as it is with economic growth. The Australian Stock Exchange, at long last, is moving upwards in price. It's grown 20% in value in the last 12 months, 10.5% since January. So the stock exchange is going up. Superannuation returns, and this is an average, are likely forecast to be mid-teens in returns, double-digit returns, meaning transport workers who have their money invested in an industry fund or in superannuation more generally can reasonably expect, on average, a return well north of 10% on their super, their retirement savings. In the last 5 years, we've seen an extra 30% rise in the number of Australian companies that are registered as companies. We also see the company taxes as a proportion of economic activity have fallen. So what we have, representatives of the Transport Workers Union of Australia, is we have low government debt by global standards. We have a stock exchange which is performing strongly again. We have the reasonable prospect of superannuation returns being well up previous years. As you know, we have a fairly constrained inflation rate, just north of 2%. We see reasonable wages growth, well north of 3%, but well within the band of anti-inflationary wage increases. And we know that we have, despite what our predecessors, the Conservatives, said, that interest rates would always be lower under a Liberal government, we've seen 11 reductions in the cost of borrowing money. And indeed, what we have, therefore, friends, is we have a strongly performing economy. Not the sort of numbers which always make the headlines, because it's dangerously like good news, not bad news. But when we look at and we look at jobs, and we've taken that terrible knock and the announcement about Ford in 2016 and 1,200 jobs. But the jobs picture in Australia is more good news than bad news. In the time that Labor has formed a government federally, in the last 5 and a bit years, there have been 960,000 new jobs added. Let me tell you, in the advanced nations of Europe and North America, there have been 28 million people added to the unemployment queues, yet we are adding new jobs. Unemployment is always the most important priority of a Labor government, and jobs and finding jobs and creating jobs and skilling people for jobs, that is what Labor governments should regard as their premier task. Because with a job, and a well-paid job and a good job, as you understand in the Transport Workers Union, people can make family-building decisions, community-building decisions, decisions where they can actually have a decent standard of living. So there you have it, the economic picture of Australia at the moment, to which I report to this National Federal Council. Jobs growth solid, inflation low, interest rates falling, strong economic performance, business investment up, more Australian companies being started and created than ever before. Employment, we have more men and women working in Australia in full-time jobs than ever in the history of this nation. These are good numbers. These are very good numbers. Numbers which can always be improved. Numbers which can't disguise the pockets of disadvantage to which Transport Union representatives and delegates and members are acutely aware. But the news is better than worse in 2013 with the Australian economy. But then we move to the Fair Work system, because just as the opposition have said there is a budget crisis, which is manifestly not the case based on that economic information I presented to you, the Conservatives and some in the right-wing media would have us believe that there was an industrial relations crisis in this country. For there is a great problem looming which requires only the heavy hand of an extreme right Conservative government led by Tony Abbott. But when you examine this so-called industrial relations issue, this problem, the facts are vastly different to the Conservative propaganda machine, which we hear tiresomely day in, day out. I've mentioned jobs are up, but let's look at industrial relations disputation, surely a test of whether or not a system is working. The average lost time, days lost in industrial dispute, under the 5.5 years of Labor stewardship, is 1/3 of the average of that under the Conservatives, who preceded us for 11 long years. 1/3. That's not a problem with industrial relations, that's an improvement. We hear this issue of productivity. We hear this argument by those who would tell you that Australia is not competing with the rest of the world. The productivity is a problem. The last 7 quarters, 3-month periods, the last 7 quarters, not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6, not 7. Sorry, not 6, 7 quarters. Labor productivity has gone up, not down. Indeed, in the last 5 quarters, we are hitting average levels of productivity not seen since 1945. So the story, friends, about Labor productivity, or workers working harder and achieving more for the same number of workers, with the same cost, the same wages, is a good story. Australia's workers, Australia's transport workers, Australia's employees going to work each day, seeking cooperation in the workplace, seeking mutuality of effort, seeking safety at work, are delivering more for Australia's productivity. And this is in a time when well over 2.5 million Australians are covered by collective agreements. This is in a time after we rid Australia of the scourge of unfair statutory individual contracts. Productivity in the Howard years fell. It fell at the same time there was a rise in individual contracts, took away on average at least one core condition of penalty rates, shift rates, entitlements which employees previously enjoyed. So there you have the workplace relations data. Strikes are down, productivity is up, real wages are moving. We are seeing jobs being created. There is no industrial relations crisis in Australia, other than that confected by Conservatives, who would simply argue against the role of unions, modern trade unions, in a modern democracy. And you look at some of the improvements this government's made, and sometimes it becomes a bit easy in our 24-hour news cycle to forget the improvements that have been made on behalf of Australia's employees. We want to tackle asbestos. We know it's going to kill another 30,000 Australians. There are people today who have not yet been exposed to asbestos fibres, who will be exposed, who will ingest and inhale asbestos fibres for no fault of their own. And we know that there will be at least 30,000 people who will die from asbestos-related lung diseases in the next 20 and 30 years. We haven't yet seen the peak of exposures for people in households, for people who become exposed to asbestos once it becomes dislodged. We know the story of asbestos because the union movement campaigned on this, and a Labor government has measured up and answered the call. We know that a third of all of Australia's houses built between 1945 and 1987 have asbestos in them. We've seen what happened to people who mined and manufactured asbestos, and we know there's another coming wave of fatalities with asbestos. We know that 650 people will die this year due to asbestos-related lung diseases, and we know many more, as I've said, have yet to be exposed to it. That is why this government is currently debating putting in legislation, presented the legislation to the Parliament, to create a national agency to coordinate our response to the eventual eradication of asbestos in public buildings and high-priority risk areas throughout our community. And the Conservatives don't know if they want to support us in this most important crusade to save lives. We also know that workplace bullying is a real scourge. The Productivity Commission, which is so beloved of our opponents when it comes to debates about penalty rates, the Productivity Commission has said that workplace bullying costs well north of $6 billion. Your union reps, you know people get bullied at work. You know it's a very difficult issue to deal with. You know that with the best will in the world, state regulators are overwhelmed. We want to make this an issue which the Fair Work Commission can deal with. Because one thing I know about workplace bullying, The sooner you deal with the issue, the more likely you are to remedy the issue. The sooner you can deal with the issue, the more likely you are to restore the balance in workplaces. We know, and I know, and you'll have seen in transport yards and in warehouses and in aviation and in all the areas you represent, you'll have seen what happens when bullying goes unchecked. You see the drastic and dramatic and tragic consequences, not just to the bottom line, but to the individual's peace of mind. So it's not just bullying, and it's best to say this government is moving on. We have also accomplished a great deal. The 10 national employment standards, paid parental leave, things which just weren't in place before this government. But I think that when you think about what this government's accomplished for your industry, there could be nothing more specific and more pertinent and more important than better road safety. You know these numbers better than I do. You can close your eyes.
And we seem to have lost the connection there, the audio link there, to the Employment and Workplace Relations Minister, Bill Shorten, who is speaking to a Transport Workers Union National Council meeting there in Darwin. So we'll leave Bill Shorten there for the moment. Moving on to other news now, and Australia's car industry is in crisis, with Ford announcing the closure of its manufacturing plants at Broadmeadows and Geelong in Victoria. 1,200 workers will